With a crisis in the subprime mortgage markets in the US, Citigroup's $43 billion exposure to mortgage-related assets resulted in billions of dollars in losses. The government at the time decided to inject $45 billion into Citigroup, as well as guaranteeing Citigroup's asset pool of $301 billion in exchange for common and preferred stock. We believe the US government bailout of Citigroup was a poor policy and a short-sighted decision, and therefore we will argue against bailing out Citigroup.
But first, let's consider why the government did in fact decide to bail out Citigroup in 2008. Citigroup has one of the furthest international reaches of any US bank, with over 200 million customers and operations in more than 100 countries. Investors have long speculated the government deems Citigroup too big to fail because a collapse could cause global havoc due to contagion. The government had an incentive to restore public confidence in the financial system by bailing out Citigroup. In the end, their capital injections boosted expectations of Citigroup's performance and stock prices, resulting in the government realising a capital gain of $13 billion.
Despite these pro-bailout points, the stronger argument is against bailing out Citigroup for a number of reasons.
The first is moral hazard behaviour. If we continue to subsidise irresponsible risk-taking, we'll just get more of it. The government's decision to go through with the bailout is a clear encouragement of moral hazard behaviour. This means that banks are protected against consequences of their actions, resulting in misalignment of incentives. This sets a precedent for banks to take on more risks, knowing that the government will be there to bail them out. This creates an unhealthy cycle of banks engaging in moral hazard behaviour like Citibank, and the government eventually having to inject capital to prevent bank failure, and so on. Secondly, another main concern was the creation of zombie banks. A zombie company is one that is kept alive through cheap capital when it should no longer be operating due to inefficiencies and poor business decisions. A major concern after the bailout was that banks would be kept alive but continue shrinking and operating inefficiently. Since the GFC, Citibank's lending has been at an all-time low, potentially showing their inability to effectively channel capital.
Thirdly, at the time of Citibank's bailout, there were clear gaps in the regulation of the financial sector. It is clear that the government realised the need for stronger regulation and attempted to address them in the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act. But why did it take one of the biggest financial crises in history for the US government to realise that there needed to be radical regulatory change? If the government had not readily bailed out banks such as Citibank, those continuous bailouts would arguably not have created the deception that the existing regulatory regime was effective, and the flaws in that regime would have been recognised and rectified a lot sooner. In summary, despite mitigating contagion, Citigroup should not have been bailed out by the government. Citigroup's bailout encouraged moral hazard behaviour, inefficient zombie banks, hidden regulatory flaws, and imposed the burden of costs on taxpayers. If we wish to promote an efficient and sustainable banking system in the future, governments should allow banks to face the risks and consequences of their own actions.